$5,000. That's the price Jasmine Crockett had to pay simply for daring to speak the truth in front of a powerful judge. But just 5 minutes later, the entire courtroom fell into stunned silence when the young woman unleashed a piece of evidence that shook the justice system to its core. Sued by Whoopi Goldberg for $50,000 in damages, what turned Jasmine, once mocked and dismissed, into a living symbol of American justice. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The morning air in Washington, D.C. was cold and tense, the kind that warned something big was coming. In her small apartment near the Capitol, Jasmine Crockett sat up in bed, fully awake. No alarm, no noise, just sharp focus. Last night, she'd gone over every legal precedent, every word of her press statement, preparing like a soldier before battle. On the table lay her case documents and a printed copy of the First Amendment. Her navy blue suit hung by the door, waiting. Today, she wasn't a press secretary. She was the target of a lawsuit filed by Whoopi Goldberg, who claimed that Jasmine's public remark, "Extremist TV shows shouldn't be publicly funded," was a direct attack on The View and her reputation. Whoopi demanded $50,000 in damages for defamation and reputational harm. And deep down, Jasmine knew this courtroom wasn't built for people like her. Outside, the city buzzed with headlines. Press secretary faces defamation trial from Hollywood royalty. Reporters waited like vultures in front of the courthouse. Inside the White House, aides whispered nervously. The legal team advised her to settle, to apologize, to disappear quietly. "You're young," they told her. "This isn't worth it." But Jasmine, her coffee steaming in one hand and her jaw clenched, answered with the same calm fire she had since law school. "If we start bowing to pressure every time the truth offends someone, then what exactly are we defending?" She tightened her bun in the mirror, the cold steel of conviction glinting in her eyes. A lesser woman might have caved, might have chosen comfort over confrontation. But not Jasmine. Not today. Today she would walk into the lion's den and stare it down. She knew the courtroom would be hostile, but she hadn't expected to walk into a battlefield dressed as justice. The doors creaked open like a warning. Jasmine stepped in, clutching her case file tight against her ribs. Her heels echoed against the marble floor, but the room was already drowned in whispers. The gallery was packed, reporters with notebooks poised like weapons. Whoopi Goldberg's entourage seated smugly in the front rows, and cameras barely concealed behind courtroom decorum. This wasn't just a trial, it was theater, and Jasmine was the villain before she even spoke a word. Her eyes scanned the space, then landed on the elevated bench where Judge Edward Grayson sat like a monarch surveying peasants. Robed in black, glasses glinting cold under the lights, his presence commanded silence, not by respect, but by force. At 63, Grayson had 3 decades on the bench and a thick file of rulings skewed heavily in favor of liberal causes. He wasn't known for neutrality. He was known for punishing those who didn't fit his ideological mold. And Jasmine, a young conservative press secretary, was his ideal target. The bailiff called the court to order, and Grayson didn't even glance up from the file in front of him. "So," he said slowly, voice laced with disdain, "this is the defendant." He didn't use her name, just the defendant, like she was a case number, not a person. Jasmine stepped forward, calm but alert. "Good morning, Your Honor. Jasmine Crockett, representing myself." Before she could finish, he cut her off with a sharp, dry chuckle. "Of course you are," he said, snapping the folder shut. "Why bother with counsel when you have an entire media machine behind you?" The room fell silent, the insult hanging in the air like smoke. He leaned forward, his tone hardening. "Let me make one thing very clear, Ms. Crockett. This is not the White House briefing room. You will not spin, you will not posture, and you will not perform. Is that understood?" Jasmine met his eyes. "Understood, Your Honor." He slammed his gavel once, harder than necessary. "Then act like it." She turned to move toward the defense table, but Grayson wasn't done. "And just so we're clear," he continued, his voice rising, "I don't want to hear speeches. This isn't Fox News. This is a courtroom. You speak when you're told. You respond when questioned. And if you grandstand, I will fine you in contempt so fast your staff won't have time to draft a press release. Muffled gasp rippled through the gallery. A reporter scribbled furiously. Jasmine didn't move, didn't flinch. But inside she felt it, the weight of every word hurled not just at her, but at what she represented. She wasn't just a young woman defending herself. She was a symbol Grayson wanted to dismantle, live and in front of a crowd, and he wasn't hiding it. Daniel Hirsch rose from his chair like a man stepping onto a Broadway stage, not a courtroom. He straightened his charcoal gray suit, gave a fleeting nod to the jury box, and approached the bench with a stack of carefully tabbed documents in one hand and a practiced look of solemn outrage on his face. "Your Honor," he began, his voice rich and resonant, "what we have here is not just reckless speech, it is professional sabotage." He held up a color-coded chart showing a steep drop in advertising revenue for The View in the weeks following Jasmine's statement. "This isn't theoretical harm," he continued. "This is concrete loss. My client, Ms. Goldberg, suffered reputational damage, financial impact, and emotional distress, all stemming from the defendant's irresponsible comment suggesting extremist shows don't deserve funding." He didn't say The View directly, but the implication was clear, and he knew it. He flashed emails from advertisers backing out of deals and read aloud tweets from random viewers blaming Whoopi personally. The backlash was immediate and fierce, he said, because this wasn't just an opinion. It was targeted defamation. Jasmine sat stone-faced at the defense table, her fingers clenched around a pen, her jaw tight but unmoving. Hirsch glanced her way and leaned into the drama. "We're not here to police opinion, Your Honor," he said, "but to protect individuals from being destroyed by public officials abusing their platforms." He turned to the gallery for effect, an old trial tactic to plant emotion in the press. Ms. Crockett may be young and well-spoken, but the damage she caused is very real. Ms. Goldberg's public image has been dragged through the mud. People who once respected her now question her integrity. And all because one government official decided to make a flippant remark wrapped in a political agenda. The courtroom held its breath. Hirsch slowly walked back to his seat, placing the final document, an invoice showing $47,500 in projected lost revenue, on the plaintiff's table like a closing knife. "We seek $50,000 in damages," he said simply, "because words have consequences, especially when they come from power." As the echo of Daniel Hirsch's final words faded, the courtroom held its breath, waiting for Jasmine to crumble or strike back. She didn't hesitate. Rising slowly from her chair, she held the folder of evidence close to her chest, stepped forward and cleared her throat. Her voice was steady but firm, her tone measured. "Your Honor," she began, "I would like to submit the full transcript of my press briefing, along with supporting documents that demonstrate—" But Judge Grayson raised his hand before she could finish. His expression was blank, but his eyes burned with irritation. "Miss Crockett," he interrupted sharply, "this court is not a dumping ground for political theater. If you think you're going to filibuster your way out of accountability, you're mistaken." Jasmine opened her folder and held up the first document. "This is the exact language used in the briefing, and it shows—" "You don't get to decide what's relevant," Grayson snapped, his voice rising. "I do." She paused, her jaw tightening. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I'm simply asking for the opportunity to present—" "I said enough," he roared, his gavel slamming down so violently that a few people in the gallery flinched. "You've made it very clear that you intend to turn this courtroom into a press room. I won't allow it. Sit down." Jasmine remained standing. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout, but her words were steel. "Your Honor, the law gives me the right to present exculpatory evidence. The documents I'm submitting go directly to the question of intent, and I—" "You are not a lawyer," Grayson thundered, rising slightly from his bench now, his knuckles white against the wood. "You may have a law degree, Miss Crockett, but don't for a second think that gives you license to hijack my courtroom. This is not a stage for your political redemption tour." Gas fluttered through the gallery. Jasmine's fingers clenched the folder tighter. Her voice lowered, but not with fear, with restraint. "Your Honor, I am not here for redemption. I am here to defend myself." Grayson leaned in, voice acidic. No, you're here to be reminded that power doesn't make you untouchable, and I will not let a media-trained mouthpiece mock this institution." Then without pause, he turned to the clerk and barked, "Put it on the record. The defendant is in contempt of court." He turned back to Jasmine and stared her down like a man trying to crush steel with his eyes. "You are fined $5,000 immediately. If you speak out of turn again, I will double it." Silence swallowed the room. Jasmine didn't move. Her cheeks flushed not from shame, but from the heat of fury buried beneath control. She glanced at the jury. Some looked uncomfortable, others confused. But one thing was clear. Judge Grayson had just made it personal. He didn't want justice. He wanted obedience. And he had just tried to break her in front of a room full of witnesses. What he didn't know, however, was that Jasmine Crockett had been underestimated her entire life. And she had never walked away from a fight where the rules were rigged. The courtroom was silent, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that trembles with tension just before something snaps. Jasmine stood frozen, her $5,000 fine echoing in her ears, the sting of public humiliation burning like acid down her spine. Around her, the gallery buzzed with suppressed whispers, scribbling pens and exchanged glances. But she didn't flinch. She didn't speak. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her leather handbag under the table. Her fingers brushed past pens, a legal pad, a pocket constitution, and finally closed around a small black recording device no bigger than a lighter. Her thumb moved with precision. A click, a soft red light. No words, just resolve. The move was invisible to most, but it changed everything. She placed the recorder face down on the table, still running, still listening. It was insurance, protection. Her only witness in a courtroom where the judge had already made it clear that facts didn't matter, only control. Jasmine knew she wasn't just facing a lawsuit. She was facing a carefully staged takedown, a weaponized courtroom where decorum was being used to smother dissent. The fine wasn't about contempt. It was about silencing her before she could speak. Every time she opened her mouth to defend herself, Grayson had cut her down with judicial authority disguised as legal procedure. But now she was collecting receipts, not out of revenge, but survival. If justice wasn't going to defend her, she'd have to build her own armor, one recording at a time. The room had been his kingdom. Every gavel strike, every interruption, every sarcastic remark from the bench had reinforced one message. Jasmine Crockett didn't belong here. But now, in the brutal stillness after his fine and his warning, the floor was finally hers. 5 minutes handed down like a reluctant gift from a man convinced she wouldn't survive even one. Grayson didn't hide his disdain. 5 minutes, he said with a sneer. Use them wisely. If you still remember what law is. A few chuckles from the gallery followed. He smirked and leaned back in his chair, arms folded, daring her to stumble. But Jasmine didn't even blink. She rose with quiet power, eyes locked on the judge. The file in her hand looked no different from any other legal folder, until she opened it like it held ammunition, not paper. "Let's begin," she said flatly, voice ringing sharp and clean across the chamber. "Because I didn't come here to ask for time. I came here to defend truth, and I only need minutes to do that." She stepped forward, each footfall steady, deliberate, controlled. "Your Honor, the First Amendment is not just a line in the Constitution. It's the foundation of every single statement made by every public servant, including me. My words were a policy stance, not a personal attack. And under New York Times v. Sullivan, 376 U.S. 254, 1964, no defamation exists unless actual malice is proven, unless I knowingly lied or acted with reckless disregard for the truth." Her voice didn't waver, and I didn't either. She glanced around the room, then back to the bench. "You already know that. The plaintiff knows that, but the record hasn't heard it until now." She pulled another document. In Hustler magazine versus Falwell, 485 U.S. 46, 1988, the court ruled that even offensive commentary, even satire, is protected unless it makes false factual claims. My statement didn't name The View. It didn't name Ms. Goldberg, and it didn't contain a single provable falsehood. They've shown no malice, no lie, no intent. She stopped then, her eyes burning cold. But I have something they don't. And with that, she reached into her bag. Grayson leaned forward, sensing movement, but he was too late. Jasmine withdrew the compact recording device and held it high. Since this court has refused to enter my documentation into the record, perhaps you'll allow your own voice to speak for itself. She pressed play. The room filled with the judge's unmistakable tone, sharp, patronizing, dripping with bias. Are you here with a lawyer's confidence, or just a young girl playing dress-up? The effect was immediate. Audible gasps cut through the silence like a blade. One reporter nearly knocked over his chair, scrambling for his camera. The courtroom, moments ago a theater of decorum and hierarchy, now pulsed with raw shock. Eyes darted from the speakers to the judge, who had gone completely still, his face frozen, blood draining from it as if the bench itself had betrayed him. A female juror covered her mouth. The court clerk stopped typing mid-keystroke. Even Whoopi leaned slightly forward, lips parted, unsure whether to gloat or be horrified. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't look around for validation. Her gaze was locked on Grayson like a spotlight. That, she said, voice low but clear, is the tone of this trial. Not impartiality, not justice, contempt, dressed in robes, and I won't be silent about it. She stepped closer to the bench, her words slicing through the tension. You've mocked me, interrupted me, punished me for asserting basic rights guaranteed by this country's constitution. And now on the record, you've exposed your own prejudice. She raised her chin. You have every right to dislike me, Your Honor, but you don't have the right to sabotage my defense. The room was still reeling from the sound of Judge Grayson's own voice echoing through the courtroom, words soaked in arrogance and dripping with bias. A young girl playing dress-up. The phrase lingered like smoke after an explosion, and in that heavy silence, one thick with shame, realization, and collective disbelief, Jasmine didn't wait. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward into the silence, not as a defendant anymore, but as the one holding the gavel no one expected her to claim. Her voice was calm, but it cut like a scalpel. Your Honor, she began, eyes locked onto Grayson. As of this moment, I am submitting a formal request for your recusal from these proceedings. She didn't blink, didn't pause. Under Title 28, Section 455 of the United States Code, and in accordance with the Federal Code of Judicial Conduct, a judge must disqualify himself when his impartiality can reasonably be questioned. I am questioning it now, and so is every person in this courtroom who just heard your words. She held up a printed copy of the code, the pages rigid between her fingers. Canon 2, Rule B, a judge shall avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety. Sir, what you said on that recording is not just inappropriate, it is prejudicial misconduct. Reporters were frozen mid-note, pens suspended in air. The clerk's hands hovered over the keyboard. A camera light clicked on somewhere in the gallery, but Jasmine didn't even notice. Her voice grew firmer, more precise. Your Honor, you didn't question my arguments. You attacked me. You dismissed my education, my right to self-representation, and my professional integrity not on the basis of law, but because I'm a young woman who dared to defend herself without asking permission. She took one more step forward. This is not about feelings. It is about fairness. And you, the one entrusted to uphold it, just proved you cannot. Judge Grayson tried to speak. His mouth opened slightly, but Jasmine raised her voice just enough to meet him. No, you will not interrupt me again. Her voice didn't shake. It sliced. I have waded through your sarcasm, your fines, your mockery, but I will not sit quietly while a federal judge violates the very oath he swore to uphold. Her hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from fury held in check. You turned this bench into a pulpit of bias. You crossed a line no robe can justify, and now I am invoking the law, not to ask, but to require that you step down. She lowered the code to the table with the finality of a verdict. Her gaze never wavered. You have compromised the integrity of this trial, and I will not proceed until an impartial judge sits in that chair. Her words rang through the chamber like a war drum, measured, righteous, unstoppable. And for the first time since she had entered that courtroom, Jasmine Crockett wasn't the one on trial. She was the one bringing judgment. The shockwave didn't wait for recess. It detonated right there, in that very courtroom, the moment Jasmine pressed play, and Judge Grayson's own voice filled the chamber with the sound of his arrogance. "Are you here with a lawyer's confidence? Or just a young girl playing dress-up?" Gasps erupted. Reporters scrambled. Camera shutters exploded like machine gun fire. But what no one realized, what even Jasmine hadn't expected, was that someone in the gallery had been live streaming the moment. Within minutes, the audio clip had been clipped, reposted, and launched into the digital stratosphere. Twitter, TikTok, YouTube. Headlines ignited. Federal judge humiliates young defendant, gets exposed on mic. The courtroom might have been sealed, but the truth had already escaped. The bailiff leaned over to whisper something into the court clerk's ear. Her fingers froze above the keyboard as her phone buzzed nonstop. Grayson noticed. He narrowed his eyes, glancing up at the gallery as murmurs spread like static. He could feel it now. The shift. Control slipping through his fingers like dry sand. But it was too late. Jasmine had already spoken the words that sealed his fate. "Your Honor," she said, her voice unwavering, "I am submitting a formal motion for your immediate recusal under Title 28, Section 455 of the United States Code." Her eyes locked with his, steady, bold, immovable. "Your impartiality has not only been questioned, it's now been publicly proven. The world heard your words. This courtroom heard your words. And justice, Your Honor, demands better." Grayson's face was a portrait of fury trying desperately to mask fear. He opened his mouth, but the sound of notifications pinging across the room drowned him out. From the jury box to the benches behind Jasmine, people were no longer just spectators. They were witnesses to something rare and raw, a system being called out from within. "This proceeding," Jasmine continued, louder now to rise above the tension, "has been poisoned by bias from the very beginning. You fined me not for disrespect, but for disobedience. You rejected evidence not because it was irrelevant, but because it came from someone you didn't take seriously. You dismissed my rights because I wasn't what you expected to see standing at this table." She held up the printed code, bolded, highlighted, precise. Canon 2, Rule B, "A judge shall avoid impropriety and the appearance of impropriety in all activities. The appearance, Your Honor, is no longer debatable. It's gone viral." A beat of silence. "I am not proceeding further until you recuse yourself." She didn't sit down. She didn't blink. She simply waited, as the courtroom held its collective breath. And for the first time, Grayson didn't speak. It wasn't his courtroom anymore. Minutes passed. Then a deputy entered through the side door, walked straight to the bench, and placed a sealed envelope into Grayson's hand. He read it, once, then twice, jaw tightening, lips pressed into a pale line. No one could hear the exact words, but they didn't need to. His next action said it all. He stood up slowly, removed his glasses, and faced the room. "Effective immediately," he muttered, voice barely audible, "I am recusing myself from these proceedings." Murmurs surged like a tidal wave. "Another judge will be appointed." He paused, eyes darting toward Jasmine. There was no apology, no acceptance, only the bitter taste of defeat. Then he turned and disappeared through the judge's exit door, leaving nothing but his shadow behind. The courtroom remained frozen until the bailiff's voice cut through. "All rise for Judge Margaret Ellis." The doors opened again, and this time, justice walked in. The courtroom had changed, but the stakes had not. Though Judge Grayson was gone, the weight of his bias still lingered like stale smoke in the air. All eyes turned to Judge Margaret Ellis now, an unshakable presence with a reputation for integrity earned the hard way. She adjusted her glasses, glanced briefly at both tables, then gave a single nod that rang louder than a gavel. "Ms. Crockett," she said, her voice firm but fair, "this court will now hear your evidence, all of it." No smirk, no interruption, just due process, finally restored. Jasmine stood. There was no hesitation in her movements now. She gathered her documents with the calm precision of someone who had waited too long to be heard and now refused to be silenced. She stepped forward, not with drama, but with absolute authority. "Your Honor, I submit into the record the full transcript of my press briefing dated 3 weeks prior, she said, placing a printed copy into the evidence tray. As you'll see, my statement, "Extremist TV shows do not deserve public funding," was made in the context of a federal policy debate regarding media subsidies. It did not name any program, person, or entity, and it did not target Ms. Goldberg. Her voice was steady as stone. This was government speech on public funding, not personal attack. Judge Ellis nodded once and signaled for her to continue. Jasmine pulled a USB drive from her folder and handed it to the clerk. "This is the original audio recording from the press briefing, unedited, time-stamped, and identical to the transcript." Then came the next piece. "Here are internal White House communications, emails between staff and press officers confirming the statement was part of a coordinated fiscal policy rollout, drafted before any controversy arose." The courtroom murmured softly, but Jasmine wasn't finished. She turned to the gallery. "Your Honor, I also have sworn affidavits from 2 independent journalists who were present during the briefing." She handed the signed, notarized documents to the clerk. "Both confirm that at no point did I reference the View or Ms. Goldberg. I now request the court allow both journalists to deliver brief testimony." Ellis reviewed the files and nodded. "Granted." The first journalist, a senior correspondent from the Washington Herald, took the stand. Calm, precise, and dispassionate, he testified, "I was in the room. There was no mention of Whoopi Goldberg. There was no suggestion of her show." The quote in question was generic. The second, a reporter from Capitol Watch, echoed the same. Ms. Crockett made a fiscal policy argument, not a personal one. Any link drawn to Ms. Goldberg came after the fact, from external media speculation. When Jasmine returned to the stand for rebuttal, she didn't waste a second. Her eyes locked on the bench, her posture upright, and her voice clear as a bell. "Your Honor," she said, "the First Amendment exists precisely to protect the kind of speech I gave that day. Government policy discussion delivered in an official capacity. Under New York Times versus Sullivan, the burden is on the plaintiff to prove actual malice, that I knowingly lied or acted with reckless disregard for the truth. They have done neither." She pulled a thick binder from her folder and laid it on the evidence table. "This is 6 months of Nielsen data for The View," she said. "It shows declining ratings long before my statement. The dip in revenue they claim was already in motion. My comment didn't cause it. It coincided with it. Correlation is not causation." She turned sharply toward the plaintiff's table, but spoke directly to the bench. "This lawsuit is not about reputation. It's about intimidation. It's an attempt to weaponize the courtroom to chill public speech. And if it succeeds, it sets a precedent that any official who voices a controversial opinion can be dragged into court, humiliated, and punished without cause. I will not accept that. And neither should this court." Silence fell like a curtain. Judge Ellis didn't speak right away. She leaned back, reviewed her notes, and finally looked up with a calm, decisive expression. "This court finds," she began, "that the plaintiff has failed to meet the legal threshold for defamation. There is no evidence of actual malice. The statement in question falls squarely within protected speech under the First Amendment." She paused for just a second. "The motion to dismiss is granted. This case is hereby dismissed with prejudice." The courtroom didn't erupt. It inhaled. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Then slowly, reporters started scribbling. Fingers tapped phones. Someone near the back whispered, "She did it." But Jasmine didn't flinch, didn't smile. She simply closed her folder with quiet finality, her shoulders steady and her chin lifted. Not in pride, but in principle. But Judge Ellis wasn't done. "Additionally," she said, lifting a separate document from her bench, "this court will submit a formal ethics complaint to the Federal Judicial Conduct Council regarding the conduct of Judge Edward Grayson during the earlier phase of this proceeding." The courtroom froze again. His remarks, as captured in the record, were not only unprofessional, they raised serious questions about bias, decorum, and his capacity to serve impartially. Another pause. "No one, no matter their title, is above the ethical standards of this institution." Jasmine lowered her gaze for a moment, her jaw set, not with triumph, but with gratitude. She had come into this courtroom surrounded by smirks and sarcasm. She now stood in a room where even the law had found its voice again. No applause, no confetti, just the quiet, powerful echo of a system that, for once, had worked the way it was meant to. And Jasmine Crockett, mocked, fined, nearly silenced, had never backed down. The marble hallway outside the courtroom was unnervingly quiet, like the eye of a storm that had just ripped through its center. The wooden double doors still swung slightly on their hinges, and the echoes of reporters rushing to file their stories hung like residual static in the air. Jasmine Crockett stood alone beneath a long row of fluorescent ceiling lights. The hem of her blazer straightened, the files in her arm finally closed, but her mind still wide open, running at full throttle. She was walking slowly toward the exit, not to flee, but to finally exhale. She had stood against a courtroom that tried to crush her with authority. She had dismantled a case built on public perception and personal insult. She had confronted a judge, forced his recusal, and walked out not just unbroken, but standing taller. But as she turned the corner toward the elevators, another shadow emerged in her path. Jasmine. That voice, not loud, not angry, just heavy, layered, unmistakable. She froze. Slowly she turned. There she was, Whoopi Goldberg, standing just 20 feet away, backlit by a dim beam of sunlight piercing through the narrow windows of the hallway. Her expression was unreadable, no longer the face of a plaintiff or the celebrity used to applause, but a woman stripped of the courtroom stage. Her eyes met Jasmine's, and for a beat, nothing was said. Just that stare, calculating, unapologetic, yet not hostile. More searching. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't flinch. "Ms. Goldberg," she greeted simply, voice cool but even. Whoopi took a few steps forward. Her pace was deliberate, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "I wasn't going to say anything," she said. "I thought I'd just let it go. Let the system do what it does. But after what happened in there, after you, I realized I'd be lying to myself if I walked away in silence." Jasmine tilted her head slightly. "You mean after the judge got caught calling me a girl in a costume?" Whoopi's lips curled slightly, not into a smile but a knowing grimace. "He was wrong," she said, "but that doesn't mean you were right." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. "You lost a defamation case in front of the press, the public, and one of the most respected judges in the district. I didn't need to be right. I just needed the truth to get one clean breath of air." Whoopi didn't move. "You know the law," she said, quieter now. "I'll give you that. You quoted every precedent. You brought the evidence. You knocked that judge off his throne with more control than I thought possible." She paused. "But knowing law doesn't mean you understand people." Jasmine narrowed her eyes, not in anger, but in scrutiny. "An emotion isn't an argument," she replied firmly. "The truth doesn't stop being the truth just because it hurts someone's feelings. The law doesn't bend to protect a reputation built on assumption. If it did, we'd all be in court every day for offending someone's Twitter feed." Whoopi stepped closer now. "That's the thing," she said. "You say this is about truth, but the truth isn't clean. It doesn't sit in a transcript. It doesn't file neatly under Exhibit B. It's messy, it bleeds, and it lands differently on people who've been fighting just to exist for decades." Her voice was rising, not shouting but pressed through gritted teeth. "When you say something about extremist TV, you may be speaking policy, but the world hears a target. My face, my name, my voice, it becomes the shorthand for what you didn't say out loud." Jasmine took a breath, her spine straight as steel. "If I had wanted to name you, I would have," she said coldly. "I don't hide behind implication. I don't attack people and pretend it's policy. I addressed a system that misuses taxpayer dollars, and you stepped into the frame not because I painted you there, but because you live in the spotlight." A silence passed. Both women now stood face to face, almost eye to eye. Not friends, not enemies, just two people who refused to blink first. "I fight for people who don't get courtrooms," Whoopi said after a moment, "for voices that aren't handed microphones or press passes. You may have won today, Jasmine, but you don't know what it's like to carry 30 years of battles on your back and still be called angry when you speak." Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't retreat. She answered softly, but it struck harder than anything she'd said all day. I fight for the people who never get to finish a sentence before someone decides they're already guilty. She took a half step forward. You think I walked into that courtroom with privilege? I walked in alone, with no legal team, no PR machine, just a constitution in my hand and a judge who wanted to bury me before I said one word. Whoopi's breath hitched, but she hit it well. Jasmine continued, voice unwavering. I didn't win because I'm smarter. I won because I refused to back down when the people in power told me I didn't belong there. Her eyes didn't waver. We're not so different, Ms. Goldberg. You want to be heard. So do I. You just don't like how I said it. A long pause followed, not the kind that ends in resolution, but in respect. Whoopi finally exhaled, slowly. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. You're not what I expected. Jasmine nodded once. Neither are you. They didn't smile. They didn't hug. They didn't offer a handshake to make it palatable for anyone watching, because no one was. This wasn't a moment meant for cameras or sound bites. It was a moment that belonged in the quiet space between two convictions, opposing, unyielding, but honest. Whoopi looked at her one last time. I still think you caused damage. And I still think you wanted to use the courtroom to settle something the law was never meant to fix, Jasmine replied. Another beat. But, Whoopi said, stepping back, you've got guts. I'll give you that. And you don't scare easy, Jasmine answered. A nod. Just one. Then they turned, each in opposite directions. No farewell, no truce. Just the silent recognition between two women who had stood in the fire and refused to move. And as Jasmine walked away, the hallway returned to silence. But everything in it had changed. Not because someone had won, but because both had stood. In a world that tried to define them, reduce them, pit them against each other for entertainment, they had faced off without blinking. Two ideologies, two battle-hardened voices, one principle in common. Never yield. And that was enough. Jasmine had barely stepped out of the courthouse when the storm began to change direction. The story wasn't just about a dismissed lawsuit anymore. It was about what that lawsuit revealed, a system where judges could humiliate defendants on record and almost get away with it. The video clip of Judge Grayson's voice mocking her as a girl playing dress-up had already racked up millions of views. The confrontation, the ruling, the ethics referral. All of it had taken on a life beyond the courtroom, rippling through public discourse like a lightning strike. But Jasmine wasn't celebrating. She didn't want to be a trending hashtag. She wanted to make sure this never happened again. Within 72 hours, she was back in Washington. Not in front of cameras, but behind closed doors, deep in the West Wing, facing a conference table filled with senior administration officials, White House counsel, legislative aides, and policy architects. Some were allies. Others were already sharpening their critiques. But Jasmine didn't care. She didn't come to ask for permission. She came to deliver a blueprint. She stood at the head of the table, dropped a 3-inch binder in front of them, and said clearly, "We need to reform how we select, train, and monitor the judiciary. Not someday, now." The room stilled. She opened the binder, flipping past color-coded tabs, each marked with brutal clarity: bias, abuse, silence, reform. First, she began, her voice controlled but pulsing with conviction, mandatory bias training for all federal judges and courtroom staff. Annual, comprehensive, and designed with real psychological and legal oversight. We do this for police. We do it for educators. But not for judges? She made eye contact with each person in the room. These are the people who determine freedom, family, and future. They cannot be shielded from self-examination. An economic advisor frowned. "Jasmine, you're proposing a level of scrutiny that will put judges on the defensive. You're asking for war." She didn't blink. "No, I'm asking for accountability. And if they feel threatened by the idea of transparency, maybe they shouldn't be on the bench." A quiet buzz passed through the room, but no one interrupted. She turned to the second tab and continued. "Second, an independent oversight commission, not internal court review, not just more judges investigating judges. This body will be made up of bipartisan legal scholars, civil rights leaders, and former litigants. They'll have access to complaint records, data on disciplinary actions, and yes, subpoena authority. We've spent decades watching judges operate in shadows. I'm bringing a flashlight. Someone at the far end of the table, a veteran legislative aide, interjected. You'll be accused of politicizing the judiciary. Jasmine leaned forward, voice dropping an octave. You mean like the judge who fined me $5,000 for trying to submit a legal document? Or the one who refused to let me speak unless I had a licensed attorney standing next to me, even though I have a law degree and every right to self-represent? She paused, letting the words hang like smoke. This isn't about politics. It's about power that's gone unchecked for too long. Then came the third point. Finally, she said, turning to the next tab, we implement judicial performance evaluations, anonymous, multi-source, and publicly available. She held up a printed prototype, a clean, 5-page report measuring judicial conduct across 10 benchmarks: case management, impartiality, courtroom behavior, and responsiveness to evidence. Doctors get reviewed. Teachers get reviewed. Even your local dog groomer gets yelped. But judges, one of the most powerful roles in American life, and they serve in near total opacity. We fix that. Starting now. There was a pause. The kind of pause that tells you the room has stopped resisting and started calculating. A senior strategist, arms folded, broke the silence. You're walking a tightrope here, Jasmine. You just went toe-to-toe with the judicial system and won. But push too far now, and they'll come for you. Judges, bar associations, even your own party. Jasmine didn't hesitate. Let them. Her voice was calm, unmoved. Let them try. Because the next young woman who walks into a courtroom alone, maybe she's not a Yale grad, maybe she doesn't know the Constitution like I do. Maybe she freezes when a judge mocks her, and she loses everything not because she was wrong, but because she didn't know how to fight back. She looked around the table, her eyes steely. I'm not pushing this reform for me. I already won. I'm doing this for the people who don't even know they're being crushed until it's too late. A few heads nodded slowly. Others glanced at each other, measuring political risk versus public goodwill. But something was shifting, not because Jasmine had yelled the loudest, but because she had blood in the open and still walked in with a plan instead of a grudge. A media advisor spoke up cautiously. If we greenlight this, we'll need to control the message. The press is already painting you as the girl who outmaneuvered the judiciary. You sure you want to lean in harder? Jasmine gave a small, tight smile. This isn't about leaning in. It's about not stepping back. She closed the binder. I'm not asking for a headline. I'm asking for a system that doesn't break people just because it can. And if you're not ready to build that with me, I'll build it anyway. She stood, adjusted her blazer, and walked to the door without waiting for approval. Behind her, the room didn't speak. It calculated, and just outside, reporters waited, microphones ready, not knowing that the next war Jasmine was preparing to fight wouldn't be about defending herself. It would be about dismantling a system that had nearly destroyed her and rebuilding it for everyone else. She didn't expect the next chapter of the battle to unfold under soft lights and a catered lunch. Just days after proposing her judicial reform package to the West Wing, Jasmine found herself at the heart of Washington's most anticipated event, the National Symposium on Judicial Ethics and Integrity. Held in the Grand Hall of the American Bar Association, the room was overflowing with rows of black-robed judges, young clerks still scribbling notes into legal pads, and policymakers whispering beneath the chandeliers. Jasmine had just finished a panel discussion on independent oversight, where she had calmly dismantled the idea that judges should be immune to civilian review. As she stepped down from the stage, nodding politely to the moderator, she sensed the air around her change. Not cold, but suddenly charged. A subtle shift in movement at the back of the room, whispers rising like static. Then from the far doors beneath the gold-plated exit sign, he appeared. Judge Edward Grayson. Jasmine froze. Her eyes locked on the man she thought she would never see in public again. He was wearing a simple gray suit, no robe, no entourage. His gait was slower than she remembered, and his presence less commanding, but somehow heavier. It wasn't the confident strut of a man who held power. It was the walk of someone who had lost it and knew exactly why. Conversations died as he stepped down the center aisle. Even the moderator at the podium paused, mouth slightly agape. I believe we have an unexpected visitor, the host murmured into the microphone. Grayson stopped at the foot of the stage. He didn't ask. He didn't demand. He looked the moderator in the eye and said, "Permission to address the room." The audience stiffened. Jasmine's fingers instinctively gripped the edge of her seat, unsure if this was arrogance or surrender. The moderator hesitated, then stepped aside. Grayson climbed the steps slowly, deliberately. When he reached the podium, he didn't look at the crowd, not at first. He looked down at the wood grain of the lectern, rubbed a finger across its edge like he was steadying himself. Then he looked up. His voice wasn't the booming authority she remembered from that courtroom. It was lower, hoarse, but it carried. "I'm not here because I was invited," he began. "I'm here because I needed to be." You could hear a pin drop. Hundreds of people, all trained to argue, now silent. "I spent 30 years on the bench, 3 decades issuing rulings, lecturing defendants, demanding decorum from attorneys. And then one day a young woman walked into my courtroom, confident, prepared, and alone. She stood where few dared to, and I—" He paused, eyes scanning the stunned audience. "I tried to tear her down, not with facts, not with law, but with tone, with doubt, with bias." He turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Jasmine's eyes across the room. "I didn't attack her argument. I attacked her presence. I mocked her for not having a legal team. I fined her $5,000 not because she disrespected the court, but because I felt disrespected." His throat tightened. "Because she dared to speak the truth in a way I couldn't control." A woman in the second row lowered her notepad. Several federal judges sat perfectly still, their expressions unreadable. Grayson exhaled. "Let me be clear. What I did wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was an abuse of power. Plain and simple." His hands gripped the podium tighter now. "I let emotion cloud reason. I let ideology override objectivity. I wore the robe, but I lost the meaning behind it." He swallowed, and for the first time, the air in the room didn't just hold silence. It held reckoning. "Some of you may say I'm here to salvage a reputation. I'm not. That's already gone. I'm here to say the quiet thing out loud. Judges are not infallible, and when we go unchecked, people suffer." His voice hardened, not angry but guttural. "We stop listening, we stop seeing, and the people before us, no matter how prepared they are, get bulldozed by ego dressed as justice." A few seats away, Jasmine's heart was racing, not because she wanted revenge, not because she needed this confession, but because she knew the thousands of people watching the live stream, sitting in law schools, courtrooms, or living rooms, needed to hear this more than she ever did. Grayson glanced down, then slowly closed his eyes for a beat. "I want to thank the woman I wronged," he said quietly. "Not because she embarrassed me, not because she fought back, but because she held up a mirror. One I refused to look in for too long." Then he looked up. "And I want to say to every judge in this room, especially those who whispered after the footage went viral, those who said, 'That could have been me,' you're right, it could have. It was. Maybe not on camera, but behind closed doors, with a sigh, a smirk, a dismissed objection. We've all worn the robe like armor instead of responsibility." He stepped back from the mic. "That's all I came to say." And with that, he turned to leave the stage. No applause, no cameras flashing, just silence, the kind you can feel in your ribs. Jasmine didn't stand. She didn't speak. She just watched as Grayson descended the stairs slowly. The weight of his confession draped over his shoulders like his old black robe, only heavier. He didn't stop at her row. He didn't ask for acknowledgement. He simply walked out through the same doors he had entered, alone. But what he left behind wasn't guilt. It was accountability, real, raw, and finally visible. And in that moment, Jasmine understood something deeper than vindication. Sometimes justice doesn't look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like a man who finally tells the truth, when no one made him. At first it felt like ripples, but within a month it was a tidal shift. Jasmine had barely closed her laptop on the final edits of the proposed federal ethics bill when news broke out of Texas. The State Judicial Oversight Board had approved a new bias accountability curriculum for every judge on the bench: municipal, county, district, and appellate. It wasn't just a workshop, it was binding, recurring, and for the first time in state history, publicly reportable. Jasmine's name wasn't on the memo, but everyone knew why it happened. The press dubbed it the Crockett effect. Then came California. Never one to follow Texas, but this time it did. Sacramento's Judicial Committee voted unanimously to pilot an independent ethics review council, with 3 civilian seats and mandatory quarterly reviews of all disciplinary reports. The announcement went viral after a local reporter tweeted, "One woman challenged the bench, and now the whole nation is watching." But Jasmine didn't pause to celebrate. She understood something the media didn't. Momentum is fragile. If not harnessed, it dissipates. She poured every spare hour into refining her reform framework, traveling between think tanks and bar associations, meeting behind closed doors with reluctant lawmakers, and pressing legal universities to add judicial behavior analysis to their core curriculum. "I'm not trying to embarrass the court," she told one skeptical dean in New York. "I'm trying to prevent the next person from walking into a courtroom and being erased before they speak." The dean said nothing for several long seconds, then nodded, almost ashamed. "You're right," he admitted. "We just didn't think it would come from someone your age." Resistance came fast and quietly. A few anonymous op-eds appeared in legal journals accusing Jasmine of undermining judicial independence. One headline read, "Is America's courtroom turning into a reality show?" Another claimed she was emotionalizing law. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She read every word, underlined the attacks, and used them to sharpen her language for her next presentation. "They can call it a show," she told her team. "I call it sunlight." The backlash wasn't just academic. In Washington, D.C., a senior federal judge privately called the White House counsel and warned, "If you let this girl keep pushing, you'll have a full-scale bench revolt on your hands." Jasmine got word of it the next day. Her response? She wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal titled, "If judges feel threatened by accountability, that's the problem." It went viral in 48 hours. Thousands of former defendants, young lawyers, and even retired judges flooded her inbox with letters, some angry, but many more filled with relief. One came from a public defender in Detroit. It read, "I've watched good people get buried in biased courtrooms for years. You didn't just make noise. You made space." Meanwhile, momentum kept building. Law schools from Stanford to Columbia requested permission to adapt her case into a curriculum module. One professor in Georgia created a course called Modern Judicial Accountability, From Theory to the Crockett Case. Students across campuses began quoting her in mock trials. A third-year law student at New York University recorded herself reciting Jasmine's cross-examination line for line, calling it the moment I decided I wanted to be a civil rights attorney. Even journalists who had once dismissed Jasmine as a political appointee started rethinking their framing. An editorial in the Boston Globe read, "She's not trying to destroy the judiciary, she's saving it from itself." And yet, through it all, Jasmine kept her tone measured, never gloating, never partisan. "This isn't about left or right," she said on a panel at Yale Law. "This is about right or wrong, about judges remembering that the robe is not a shield, it's a responsibility." Her words weren't abstract. She had lived it. She still remembered standing in that courtroom alone, being called a little girl in a suit, and fined $5,000 for daring to ask the judge to review a document. That humiliation didn't just sting, it clarified. And now the very moment that had been used to shame her was being studied in lecture halls as a turning point in modern American jurisprudence. One morning, as she was walking through the halls of Georgetown Law, after a closed-door briefing with faculty, a student ran up to her, breathless. He held out a printed copy of her hearing transcript, highlighted, annotated, well-worn. "You don't know me," he said, voice shaking, "but what you did changed the way I see everything. My professor used to talk about structural bias like it was a theory. You made it real." Jasmine took the paper, nodded, and handed it back. "It's real," she said, "and it's everywhere. Now go change it." The personal victory she had bled for, emotionally, professionally, had turned into a systemic lever, and she wasn't done pulling it. Back in Washington, her bill, the Judicial Integrity and Transparency Act, moved from proposal to committee review. Her reform plan had been picked up by three major Senate sponsors, one Republican, one Democrat, one independent. That's what legitimacy looks like, she told a journalist who asked how she managed to unite the ununitable. Her answer was simple. The law is supposed to protect all of us. That includes the people we don't vote for. From the courtroom to the State House, from student notebooks to legislative drafts, Jasmine Crockett's personal war had become a national call to arms. She hadn't just survived the system, she had forced it to look in the mirror. And it blinked. The mail bin was overflowing again. It wasn't spam, not political mailers. These were handwritten, soul-carved letters, many bearing creased corners and faded ink. The kind people write when they have no other outlet, no microphone, no courtroom, no seat at the table. Jasmine sat quietly in her office, skimming through the latest batch as DC's cold night air pressed against the window panes. One letter in looping cursive came from a 68-year-old grandmother in Tulsa whose nephew had been falsely convicted at age 19. For the first time, she wrote, I believe there's someone fighting who doesn't forget the ones we already lost. Another came from a law student at Howard University. I keep your courtroom speech in my wallet. When I doubt myself, I read it and remember, truth isn't loud, it's steady. A padded envelope held something else, a faded courtroom transcript from 2003, with a red circle around a judge's dismissal of evidence without explanation. The sender's note was just one line. They never listened to me. Maybe now someone will. Jasmine set it down gently. These weren't just fan messages. They were testimonies from a broken system, laid at her feet like evidence. She wasn't sure how many she had received. Hundreds? Maybe thousands. She hadn't counted. She wasn't trying to. What she did keep track of was one piece of paper. It hung quietly on her office wall, framed in matte black, directly across from her desk where she couldn't help but see it every single morning. The $5,000 contempt fine, issued by Judge Edward Grayson, signed, stamped, final. When guests entered her office, their eyes always landed on it, confused, curious. Some assumed it was a mistake. Others thought it was a private joke. One clerk once asked, "Is that real?" Jasmine just smiled. As real as the bruise it left. But her smile never held bitterness. For her, that fine was no longer a mark of shame. It was a declaration, a badge of war. Not the cost of failure, but the cost of refusal to yield. Every inch of progress she'd made, every policy drafted, every program adopted in Texas or California, every amendment discussed in Congress, had started from that moment of humiliation, when a judge tried to crush her with power and she didn't flinch. "It's not a symbol of punishment," she once told a reporter. "It's proof I was never afraid of being punished for doing the right thing." The room around her had grown darker now, lit only by the glow of city lights blinking through the tall windows of the federal building. Across the Potomac, the Capitol shimmered under the night sky, majestic yet heavy, like a monument to potential still unmet. Jasmine stood from her desk and moved toward the glass, one hand resting on the edge of the window frame. She didn't need noise, or headlines, or another article calling her America's legal insurgent. She just needed quiet clarity, and tonight she had it, because she knew something the world was only just beginning to understand. The real fight had only just begun. The courtroom battle, the humiliation, the bias, the obstruction, the firestorm that followed, was never the climax. It was the ignition point, and now the system was moving, slowly, grudgingly, but it was moving. Judges were enrolling in training they once mocked. State legislatures were drafting bills that hadn't been considered in decades. And people, ordinary people, were daring to believe that accountability didn't have to come from above, but could rise from the ground up, from one voice, one fight, one refusal to sit down. Her phone buzzed once behind her, a message from an intern in Oregon, a photo of a local courtroom bulletin board with her quote, pinned beside the Constitution. "I didn't do this to be liked. I did it because it was right." She read it once, then again, letting the words, her own words, sink back into her chest like armor being reforged. Because it wasn't admiration she wanted, it was continuation. She turned back toward the room, her reflection now only partially visible in the window. That was okay. This story didn't need to center her face. It was now about something much larger. Systemic shifts, cultural recalibration, quiet revolutions waged by those with nothing but principle in their pocket and scars on their spirit. Outside Washington, D.C. pulsed on, the heartbeat of democracy messy and flawed. Inside, Jasmine remained still but steady, a soldier not of politics, but of principle. The fine still hung, the mail still came, the battle still burned, and Jasmine Crockett, no longer just the woman mocked in court, wasn't going anywhere. Because justice doesn't sleep, and neither would she. Not until the system changed. For good. There are stories that entertain, and then there are stories that wake you up. Jasmine's wasn't just a legal drama. It was a quiet rebellion against a system that too often favors age over merit, power over truth, silence over courage. She didn't come from a political dynasty. She didn't have a legal army. All she had was her voice, her conviction, and a mountain of resistance staring down at her from the judge's bench. And yet, she didn't flinch. That's where the real lesson begins. Justice isn't reserved for those who are the loudest, the wealthiest, or the most connected. It belongs to those who are willing to stand alone, in hostile rooms with nothing but the law in one hand and integrity in the other. The courtroom was just the first battlefield. But the war she walked into wasn't just about a defamatory lawsuit or a biased judge. It was about every unseen case like hers across the country. Every defendant silenced. Every young professional mocked for their youth. Every woman told she was too emotional, too ambitious, too loud, or too alone. Jasmine's defiance didn't just restore balance in one case. It cracked open a conversation about who holds power and why. Her pain became precedent. Her humiliation became momentum. And the penalty they tried to use to break her, it became her badge of resilience. She didn't win because the odds were in her favor. She won because truth doesn't need permission to stand its ground. But perhaps the deepest message lies not in her victory, but in her restraint. Jasmine didn't use her win to gloat. She didn't weaponize her popularity. Instead, she redirected every ounce of attention into systemic reform. For people she may never meet, in courtrooms she'll never see. That's not politics. That's principle. And it reminds us that the real power doesn't come from the gavel. It comes from the people brave enough to hold it accountable. Her journey is a warning to the corrupt, but it's also a blueprint for the just. If you've ever felt ignored, outmatched, or outnumbered, this story is your reminder. One voice can still tip the scale. One woman can still move the system. And one truth, when spoken at the right moment, can still echo louder than a judge's gavel. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.